A reading from John's Gospel, the 13th chapter, verses 31 through 35. This will be familiar because it is what we often hear on Maundy Thursday. This is part of what Jesus told his disciples that night. Listen for God's word. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now, the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, that makes it pretty clear, doesn't it? How can you spot a Christian? How do you know if someone's a Christian? Is it their bold profession of faith? Is it their great head knowledge? Oh, they know the Bible, they know theology. Jesus says, no, it's not that. The world will know you are a Christian because of your love for one another. That's what Jesus says. That's how Jesus says people will be able to tell if we are Christians. So, why is it then that we so often fail to recognize each other? After all, you see a friend, you see a family member, you know them, you recognize them. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. But interestingly, there is a relatively recently discovered disorder that for some people makes distinguishing faces, one face from the other, quite difficult. These people suffer from an actual documented disorder, this has been studied and proven, called, this is a mouthful, prosopagnosia. But because it's such a mouthful, is often referred to simply as face blindness. For example, Cecilia Burnham, who is 38 and lives in Stockholm, Sweden, is one such sufferer. She can barely describe her mother's face, and she struggles in photos to even pick out herself. She continually loses friends because they encounter her on the street or in a restaurant or something, and she doesn't recognize them, so she ignores them. So people think she's stuck up or too self-centered to say hello. But in fact, they actually look like strangers to her. People with face blindness can see eyes, noses, and mouths just as well as anybody else can, but somehow they lack the ability to recognize once all of these pieces are put together, and when they see someone, they don't recognize that other person. Until a few years ago, face blindness was thought to be extremely rare. Only about 100 cases have been documented worldwide, and most of those were thought to be the result of brain injury. But a few years ago, a team of German researchers released the results of a study they'd undertaken on this. And it was published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics, and their investigations revealed that the condition is much more common than previously thought. Based on their studies, it is likely that there are more than 5 million sufferers in the United States alone. What's more, Their research found that many cases of face blindness are not the result of brain injury, but of a defective gene. That means this disorder can be inherited. If one of your parents has face blindness, there's a 50% chance that you will have it as well. Think about this for a moment. How different would your life be if you could not remember or recognize faces? And when you think about that, you'll understand what a significant problem this is for the people who suffer from face blindness. Now, certainly, this is a recent discovery, and face blindness was unknown as a diagnosis back in the first century when Jesus was around. But the New Testament actually has an example of it. On the first Easter, two followers of Jesus were walking on the road to Emmaus. We talk about this when I have communion, right? When Jesus joined them, but according to Luke, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Only later, when he broke the bread and gave it to them, did they realize it was Jesus who was with them. Now, of course, we don't know that they were suffering from face blindness. There's probably a miracle involved in this. And they were seeing the resurrected Jesus for probably the first time. So that probably accounts for the problem here. But it's interesting to me that even before the resurrection, when Jesus was among his followers, he alluded to a kind of recognition problem that the world could have for which Christians are responsible. Heard it in our text today. Here's Jesus with his disciples, the Last Supper. They've just sent Judas out. And Jesus told them that he loved them and that they should love one another. In fact, he called that a new commandment. Now, in one way, it wasn't new at all. Centuries before, the concept is articulated in the Old Testament, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Yet there was a newness about what Jesus was saying here, for he intended that his followers' love for each other be a plain and clear feature of their identity. That's why he said, by this, meaning the love we have for each other, everyone will know you are my disciples. Everyone will know my disciples if you have love for one another. And here's what's interesting. Although certainly in other places Jesus talked about loving neighbors and loving enemies, here he is saying that acting compassionately toward our fellow believers, both in our church here and Christians everywhere, is the way that people outside the church will know that we are his disciples. Now that's the positive way to state it, but consider the flip side. Jesus implies that it's possible for Christians to try to live in the world without being recognized as Christians. To bring it right to our own day, Jesus' new command means that if the world can know we are Christians by our love for one another, which is what he says in the text, the world can also fail to recognize us as Christians when we don't love one another. In other words, the world can have face blindness when it comes to distinguishing Christians from everybody else. Now, right off, there are a few things that might contribute to this. The first is pretty simple. The practice of loving one another is, of course, not limited to Christians. We do not have a monopoly on loving each other. Unquestionably, there are people who claim no allegiance to Jesus Christ at all, who nonetheless behave lovingly toward other people, toward their colleagues or friends or coworkers or family members. As well, many times, to strangers who are in need. And many more in the world at large at least hold loving one another as an ideal. It's a good idea, they would say, and give it lip service. Hence the appeal of the pop song from a number of years ago that said, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of." So there can be some difficulty distinguishing Christians from others by their love, because we live in a society that at least says it honors love for one another, even if it often does not practice it. Another reason for the world's face blindness about Christians is that we ourselves don't always grasp the depth of love Jesus was calling for among his disciples. Loving enemies, of course, well, that's hard. That's difficult. And I think most of us can admit that loving neighbors can be pretty hard work sometimes too, especially that lady who's in charge of the homeowners association, right? So it would seem that by comparison, merely loving our fellow church members, well, that should be a snap. That should be easy. But you know what? In some ways, that might be even harder. You find this out in mission work often. Doing something compassionate for someone on the other side of the planet, or reaching out to a person we see only occasionally, doesn't require great emotional investment. I heard someone say one time, if you want to raise money for missions, send it to hungry children overseas. People will do it. But what happens when it starts getting closer to home? You see, we don't know those kids. We don't know anything about them. But when it comes to people we know well, when it comes to people that we see at least every week and sometimes multiple times a week, people who we see up close and interact with frequently, loving can get a little bit hard. One pastor tells the story of taking a team from his church in Ohio to work on homes of low-income families in a financially depressed part of eastern Kentucky. While they were working on one home, a minister who pastored a nearby church stopped by and thanked the Ohio team for the work they were doing in his community. But then, in private conversation with the pastor, he mentioned this: some members of his own church would also like to participate in work camps to help others. But he found he had to take them somewhere other than where they lived. Had to take them outside of their home area. Around here, he said, everybody knows everybody else. And when I propose fixing up the homes of some of our neighbors, people are reluctant. They say things like, well, I'm not sure they really need our help. Or, I'm not sure they really deserve our help. Because you see, I know what's going on with them. We've all been gossiping about it. I know what's happening with them. I don't really feel like helping them. But, he said, if I take them somewhere else where they don't know anybody, they'll pitch right in and work hard. You see, sometimes it may be harder to love those close at hand. Another reason for the world's difficulty recognizing Christians by their love for one another is that Jesus set the bar very high for relationships within the church. He said this: just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Kind of wish he hadn't said that, you know. Earlier that evening, evening of the Last Supper, Jesus had given one demonstration about what he meant by loving one another when he had knelt down and washed the feet, the very, very dirty feet of his disciples. That alone should give us pause when we think about loving one another. But there's even more reason to realize the seriousness of this new command from Jesus when we remember that the fullest expression of Jesus' love for his disciples would occur just a few hours later, when he would lay down his life for them and for us. And he is saying, that's how we're supposed to love one another. That's what he meant. Now, I realize that today, where we live, many of us are probably not going to be required to actually die for our fellow believers. There are places in the world where that still happens, by the way. And I realize is that foot washing is a bit out of fashion, at least around Presbyterian churches. So what does loving one another within the church look like then? We can get some understanding by looking back at the early church. The church was really interesting back before it became an institution, back before Constantine made it okay to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. When the church was struggling, when the church was threatened, the church didn't know it was going to survive. It grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. Isn't that interesting? Tertullian was one of the church fathers, so-called, you'd perhaps say church parents would be a better way to put that. He lived from about AD 160 to 220. He was a leader of the church in Carthage in North Africa. That was a major Christian center in those days. He wrote extensively about the Christianity of his time. And he described how church members contributed money to help others both outside and inside the church. He called their gifts Piety's Deposit Fund. And he said that the monies are not taken thence and spent on feasts and drinking bouts and eating houses, but to support, listen to this, very poor people. Paying for funerals. To supply the wants of boys and girls who lack means and who have no parents. To support old people who are confined to their homes. To support those who have suffered shipwreck, if they have to be perhaps working in the mines or banished to the islands or shut up in the prisons because of their faith. The church took care of all of those people. Tertullian also went on to tell how outsiders regarded this. How the outsiders looked at these charitable good deeds done by Christians. They said, it is mainly the deeds of a love so noble that lead many outside the church to put a brand upon us and say about Christians, see how they love one another. How they are ready even to die for one another. When Tertullian was alive, that's how the people outside the church viewed Christians. That's how people outside the church viewed those who were in the church. Now, there were other voices that were not so complimentary. Tertullian tells us about a man named Lucian, who was a contemporary roughly of his. He was a Greek satirist. And in one of his books, he mocks the reckless generosity of Christians. He says, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would anyone want to live like that? They sacrificially help a person they don't even know. simply because that person was another Christian. So, certainly one way to live out Jesus' command to love one another is through charitable support. In that regard, however, the actions are much the same as might be extended to someone in need outside the church, right? We want to help our brothers and sisters, but we want to help those outside. That's in obedience to Jesus' larger command to love our neighbor. But let's get to the crux of it. How does the love of one another play out here in the church? How does it play out in our day-to-day lives together here in this place? It's a challenge for all of us. It's a challenge for me too. Are we willing to apologize to one another, especially when we have been mistaken or failed to help or support one of our fellow Christians? Do we have a forgiving spirit? Are we willing to make peace with those within the church who have hurt us? When we find ourselves in disagreements, how do we handle it? Do we begin in prayer about the issue and then approach the other person in a spirit of non-belligerence, with the goal being not to win the argument, but to solve the problem? Is that what we model? Is that what the world would see if they looked at us? Would the world recognize us as Christians? One way we can get a handle on what it means to love one another within the church fellowship is to consider to what lengths we are willing to go for each other. Sometimes parents learn something about going to the limit when one of their children gets in serious trouble. We've known of parents who went to extraordinary lengths to help one of their children, far beyond what they'd ever do for themselves. Parents who are normally quiet and unassuming have called in personal favors, exhausted their bank accounts, pleaded with judges, appealed to teachers, prostrated themselves before authorities, and accepted humiliation to try to help their kid in difficulty. As outsiders to those situations, we may sometimes wonder if the young person in question deserves such love. But it is hard to fault the parents who are trying to move heaven and earth to save their child. We can understand that, of course, when it is parents assisting their own child. But Jesus' remarks suggest that it is a hallmark of Christians that they do things like that for each other. People to whom they have no other connection than a common belief in Jesus Christ. We cannot explain ahead of time what it will mean to be Christ-like in every relationship with other believers. Relationships in human nature are complex and difficult things, and situations we could never have anticipated arise. That's all true. But Jesus' new command gives us not only a place to start, but also a spirit in which to act, and a goal, unity and love, toward which to move. As we internalize this command to love each other and put it into practice, we go a long way toward dispelling the face blindness of those on the outside. And we enable them to see the features of Christ in our life together as the church, as we strive to be the ones He has called us to be. After all, they will know we are Christians by our love. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.